where they strung up a man, whom they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Drink coffee and get things done. Drink better coffee and get better things done. To get the best coffee on earth, go to the Organic Man Coffee Trike 4501 McPherson. Julio roasts his own coffee, so you know it's fresh. You can smell it when you come through the door. And I don't think there's anything that smells like fresh roasted coffee. If it's just too far to drive, you can get his coffee at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. I've done 2 shows on shadow beings. The first one was in July 2016, and the second was May of 2020. While making some cookies the other night, I was listening to Trailer Park Terrors. It was an archived show from February. Vic was talking to a couple of guests about the Hat Man and shadow beings. Some of their questions and a few of their ideas got me to thinking about what these things might be. A lot of people out there will parrot the saying, these things were all created on Creepypasta or some such website. There's no such thing as the Hat Man or shadow beings. It's all just in people's imagination. Right up there with the rake. Over the years, as I've looked into strange things, I've come to the conclusion anytime some kind of a bizarre creature begins to grow in popularity, some shadow government maybe, some agency will send out people, or they'll send out messages to one of their minions, someone who works on a website perhaps. And they'll say, make up some stories dealing with these things, like what folks are seeing. People hear the stories and they read the articles, and then they get the two mixed up. Hollywood is probably in on this as well. Movies come out showing encounters, but with the usual Hollywood twists and turns. When somebody mentions an encounter or a sighting, the naysayers come out with this, it's all just a dream or imagination based on that movie. Too many people can't distinguish between actual events and things that have been seen on the big screen. The first story of The Rake is supposed to be from a contest for writers to come up with short stories. The website 4chan had a story about a thin, bald headed creature with pale white skin. From there, it is passed from one website to another. After a few stories were told, one person said they had a photograph of this creature, and it looks like a photoshopped image to me and a lot of other people, but there are some folks out there that will look at it and say, oh, that's a real creature. Or there's other people that will look at it and go, somebody's made that up. The photo was given the name The Rake. The story went through many changes and alterations as it was spread around. Granted, the name might have come from somebody on the internet, but the sightings of these skin and bones pale creatures can be found from centuries ago. The trouble with the internet is those who wish to control history tend to change things that they don't agree with. You can find a story dated from the 1500s only to discover that it was actually written last week. Remember what Abraham Lincoln said: if it's on the internet, it must be true. The shadow beings that appear to some folks is nothing new. It became popular over the years, and popularity leads to mimicry. Some people can't sit still and leave things alone, like those two guys that found a Bigfoot frozen in a block of ice. Some of the public was impressed, but the folks that I know who study these things all said it looked like a gorilla costume in a block of ice, which it turned out that's what it was. One of the earliest known written reports of shadow people comes from the late 1800s. A man named James Kidd reported seeing a shadow figure in his room that appeared to be reaching for him. The figure was described as a shadow person, and Kidd claimed that it disappeared as soon as he turned on the light. In 1950s, a man named Art Campbell reported seeing a shadow figure in his home that appeared to be just watching him. The figure was described as a tall, thin shadow with no discernible features, and it also disappeared when Campbell turned on the light. 1975, a man in the Philippines reported seeing a creature that he described as being 7 feet tall, bald, with eyes that glowed red. Some say they have seen shadow people in Hiroshima. These are shadowy figures that are said to appear in the bombed out city. They are often seen near the memorials and statues that commemorate the victims of the atomic bomb. Some say the shadow people are the ghosts of those who died in the bombing. This has led to some believing that shadow people are simply ghosts that don't have enough energy or the know how to take on the full form. A witness from Russia said he saw a shadow being when he was about 8 or 9 years old. For years, he was seeing vaguely human shaped shadows out of the corner of his eye. At the time, he didn't give it much thought. As these sightings became more prevalent, the shadow beings could be seen standing right in front of him, a human silhouette where there was no one to cast it. One day, after seeing someone outside his window, he looked closer and he saw a black shadow moving away. As the years went by, these sightings grew less frequent and then they stopped. Shadow beings are seen all over the world and by all kinds of people. Most folks say they were scared of these things, while others thought that maybe this shadow was just passing by and there was nothing to be afraid of. Being just a shadow, there's no evidence of their passing. No footprints, no hair samples. People have caught a few photographs over the years, but photos are becoming less and less believable as things like Photoshop get better and people create images to either try making themselves famous or to mess with others. As far as I can find out, few people have heard sounds from these creatures. Footsteps have been heard just before or just after sightings, but whether the sound is actually from this shadow being or something else is unknown. Some have speculated that shadow beings as ghosts that are having difficulty forming into human shape. They are creating the outline, but none of the details. Others say that shadow beings are evil spirits trying to take over the people that see them. I was writing a horror story years ago. It was called Shadows. I was halfway through with absolutely no idea how I was going to finish the story. I got to talking to my nephew John one day, and he's half Ho Chunk Indian. He told me that his mother said shadow beings are evil spirits that will sneak up on people who are in a less than sober state in order to take possession of their bodies for not nice reasons. When folks are using drugs or alcohol to put themselves into a stupor, these creatures will strike. No matter the beliefs of the witnesses, the shadow beings all pretty much look the same. A solid black image that looks real and corporal, with no details other than sometimes they will see eyes. The eyes always seem to be glowing red. When people do see eyes, they're almost always that color. Being a dark shape, usually on a dark background, these eyes can really stand out. Folks doing research have said that the red eyed creatures are demons or evil entities that are up to no good. When Ishmael and I had that weird encounter in the basement of the old hospital, that being didn't have any eyes that either of us saw. The video just shows an all black humanoid shape lunging from a dark doorway. We must have watched that video 100 times. While showing the video at the McAllen Library, one of the guests said that she saw a skull in one of the frames, just for a second. There is a whitish face that did resemble a skull. Somehow we'd never seen this until that woman pointed it out. By advancing the video one frame at a time, we were able to all see what she had caught in less than a second. Next time you're walking along a dark corridor and you think you see something out of the corner of your eye, don't be too quick to write it off as just your imagination. We were in the basement of a hospital, and we were walking to the morgue. You would expect ghosts to hang out in such a place. A lot of sightings are in places not associated with death. Others there have been in historical catastrophes. Reports describe shadow people as pitch black apparitions that appear intelligent. They move unnaturally fast, and they have been seen to reach through or walk through solid objects. A black shadow of a hand or an arm extending from a wall or even a piece of furniture. Sometimes these apparitions are simply seen lurking in the corners or in doorways without doing anything unsettling, like seeing a lion sleeping in a zoo. You look at it, but you don't feel any danger. On the other hand, if you're walking across the savannah in Africa and you see a lion and he's looking in your direction, well, now that's going to be unsettling. If you have a pork chop in your pocket, well, that's just weird. Who carries a pork chop in their pocket? In a lot of encounters with shadow beings, the witness sees the thing, but they don't know or understand what is there, what they're seeing. The shadow moves away and vanishes into a wall or just around a corner. After the encounter has come and gone, the witness realizes that they just had a run in with the paranormal. The image becomes engraved on their memory. Folks will ask, well, why didn't you get a picture of it? The idea of grabbing a camera never crosses your mind. It wasn't they were seeing a bizarre thing that needed documenting. The encounter was unknown, and so the camera never crossed their mind. I've heard from dozens of witnesses of strange things. They say they didn't grab their camera until after the encounter. It was just a good thing that Ishmael was wearing those glasses that had a camera built into them, and they recorded that everything he looked at. You can find glasses like that at Amazon for about 45 to 50 bucks. A friend of mine was in Galveston walking along the Strand. This was back when the area was still a whole lot nasty. The city was working on making this domain of criminals and thieves into a tourist attraction. A man standing in an alleyway asked him a question, and so he glanced at his watch and he told the guy what time it was and then continued walking. His girlfriend was all shook up and she couldn't speak. Finally, she said that that guy was holding a gun and he had told their boyfriend to hand over his wallet. I'll bet that crook thought that this victim was either nuts or Superman or something. The shadow being is usually called a shadow man. The size and the shape is more masculine than feminine. No lady parts have ever been visible. I've never come across a report of a shadow being with a curvy figure. Looked like Jessica Rabbit or something. A lot of folks who have seen a shadow man have said that it had a hat on its head. The brim was usually distinguishable. Some have said that it looked like a fedora, a style of hat that was popular in the 1920s. Humphrey Bogart wore a fedora in a lot of his movies. A lot of you listeners are saying, who in the world was Humphrey Bogart? Jim Mars, the writer, also was almost always seen wearing a fedora. In fact, I only saw him one time when he didn't have his hat on. Vic came up with a question on whether or not the Hat Man was seen in other countries since the fedora is more popular on this side of the planet. I did some digging, followed by a lot of digging. There are a lot of people saying that there were reports of people seeing the Hat Man in Asia and Europe. I searched the Hat Man Project website and I did find a few stories. In 2016, in the Czech Republic, a man was in his home relaxing when his dog began barking towards the window. The man went to the window, but he didn't see anyone. The dog kept barking as if someone were outside. The man went out the door along with his dog. Once outside, he saw a shadow being with a wide brimmed hat standing in the yard. Thinking this was somebody wearing a costume, he challenged the shadow, asking who he was and what he wanted. The dog stayed between him and the shadow the whole time, ready to defend. The shadow stood about 7 feet tall, no visible features. It was dark outside, but the man could see the shadow did have a hat on, and it was wearing a long coat. After a few seconds, the Hat Man simply vanished. I believe this next witness was a young boy named Deniz from Istanbul. I looked up the name and it said that it was a boy's name, so hope I'm not saying the wrong thing here. In 2018, he was in his bedroom when something woke him up. He was terrified and he couldn't move. A dark shape was standing right next to his bed, leaning forward as if it was examining him. The shadow eventually vanished, and Denise believed that this was a harbinger of something bad about to happen. About 2 weeks or so later, Denise was in his room once more when he heard his grandmother calling from the living room. As he was getting out of bed, a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, walked into the room and said that his grandmother was calling. Deniz had no idea who this boy was, but he went to see what his grandmother wanted. Walking down the stairs, he encountered the Hat Man in the hallway. Deniz turned and ran back the way that he had come. The Hat Man was right behind him. This was so much like a dream, but he had an overpowering feeling if the Hat Man caught him, he would die. Looking back, he saw that the Hat Man was now accompanied by two shadow beings. They chased him out onto the roof of the house. Running to the edge, Deniz hoped if this really was a dream, he could jump from the roof, but he would wake up before hitting the ground. Well, he hit the ground. He rolled over and he got to his feet, wondering why he was still in the dream. The Hat Man and his two shadow beings began chasing him down the street. Running along, trying to escape, Deniz did wake up in his bed, wondering what in the world was going on. One second he's running for his life, and the next he's back in bed. Over the following few months, the three beings would harass him from time to time. Eventually, he stopped seeing them, but he always felt as if they were there, watching him from the darkness, waiting to spring some kind of a trap. His family eventually moved to the U.S., and Deniz hasn't seen the Hat Man or his followers since having left Turkey. Javiera lived in Chile. She'd seen the Hat Man twice. The first time was when she was about 4 or 5 years old. She was watching TV in her parents' bedroom, laying on the bed. From the corner of her eye, she saw someone was standing in the doorway. Looking, Javiera saw a shadowy figure with a wide brimmed hat. It just stood there, not moving. Wondering what she was seeing, Javiera moved towards it to get a better look. At first, she felt as if this creature was waiting for her to come to it. So she got closer. The energy that the Hat Man was giving off became a bit overpowering, a bit frightening. Javiera began to retrace her steps back towards the bed when the Hat Man simply vanished. She looked around the room, but there was nothing there. Years later, when she was about 21 years old, she was with her boyfriend who was visiting her parents' home. They had separate bedrooms, but they were messing around at 3 o'clock in the morning. Javiera felt as if someone was up walking around the house in the middle of the night. She became scared that it might be her folks, and that they might catch them in flagrando delicto. South America doesn't have quite the same kind of law enforcement that we do here in the States, and she also started to worry that maybe someone had broken into the house to possibly kidnap her. This happens a lot down there. Standing in the door of the bedroom was a tall, dark figure. Javiera said that she could feel anger radiating from this figure. She felt as if whoever this was, they wanted to kill her. The room was being partially lit by moonlight coming through one of the windows. The shape was solid black. The only feature was bright red eyes that seemed to glow from within. Javiera began to feel as if the Hat Man was feeding off of her fear. The energy she was giving off was making this thing stronger. She also felt as if it wanted more than just fear, it wanted to consume her physical body as well. She tried to point out the Hat Man to her boyfriend, but all he saw was a dark doorway. Javiera thought that she was going to die, but the shadow vanished before this happened. After seeing the Hat Man twice, Javiera got to thinking about all the times she thought that someone or something was watching her. She believes that this was the devil or one of his minions. It wanted her soul, but it was waiting for her to come to him instead of simply taking her. A young girl living in Australia was laying in bed one night when a dark shadow of a tall man with a wide brimmed hat and a long coat entered her room. She was facing the door, and her room was being painted, so the bed was in the middle of the floor. The shadow stood in the doorway for a few seconds. The witness didn't like anything paranormal or scary, so she closed her eyes and hoped that this thing would go away. Kids have this thing about if they can't see the monster, it can't see them. The old pull the covers up over the head trick. If you ever read Terry Pratchett's stories, in one of them they have an anti-monster device. It's like a towel that they pull out and they place over their head so that the monster can't get them because they can't see the monster. It was Terry Pratchett was quite a writer. Kids, like I said, have that thing about, well, it can't see me, so I can't see it, so it can't see me thing. The next morning, she mentioned her bizarre encounter to her family. Her mother was very superstitious and thought that this was some kind of an evil spirit. Her older brother said that he had seen the same thing one night back when he had the room that she was now using. She drew a sketch of what she had seen, and he said that that was exactly what he had seen. That was the only time either of them ever saw this thing. I've noticed in several encounters, not just the Hat Man, but I believe one or two were also the Dog Man encounters. I do believe that I read about these in Josh Turner's book, or one of the two. It must have been the Dogman Encounters. I think that's what it's called. Anywho, people see a bizarre creature that scares the heck out of them, and then they fall asleep almost immediately after. You'd think with the heart pounding in their chest they wouldn't be able to sleep. It's almost as if the energy drain is so great that they slip off even after seeing something that should make them stay awake. I've also heard about how some parents will see that their child is terrified and just tell them, go back to sleep. It's nothing. It's just your imagination. I hate to think any kind of a mind control might be involved here. If so, this makes all of these encounters that much more frightening. Seeing a monster is one thing, having it inside your head is just too much. Hang on a sec. There they are. Yes, it was Werewolves and Dogmen Phenomenon by Josh Turner. If you don't like the normal tree hugging, granola munching Bigfoot stories, check out Josh's stories. Not all shadow beings look like people. Some look like animals. Julio used to live in Francisco y Madera, which is a small town to the northeast of Torreon, Coahuila in Mexico. The town was mostly adobe brick houses with a few larger buildings here and there. Across the street from his home was a plaza filled with trees and bushes, and this was where all the birds would congregate early in the morning or late at night. The birds were always very active, making a lot of noise as they sat there in the trees, discussing things like wind speed and the weather, I guess. What do birds talk about? Next to the plaza was a one-story warehouse. The roof was about 10 feet high, and there were no windows, only the doors to move items in and out. One day, Julio found some clay items hidden in the bushes outside of his home. One of the items looked like a clay whistle, and the other was clay, but it's been a long time ago, and he doesn't remember exactly what it was. Being a young boy, 10 years old at the time, he cleaned up the two items, and the whistle still worked. W- Why the two objects were in the bushes, he didn't know, and nobody ever was able to answer. That same night, at about 8 p.m., he was standing in front of his house when he saw a huge black shadow. It was on the other side of the street near the warehouse. As Julio watched, the shadow leaped up onto the roof of the warehouse, 10 feet jump. As it moved, Julio could have sworn it was a giant dog. The shadow was about 7 or 8 feet long, and it looked as if it only had one rear leg. The shadow disappeared up onto the roof and was gone. Julio didn't know if this was a connection between the two clay items that he had found and the giant black dog. It was odd that he found the whistle and the other item at the same day that he had this shadow dog encounter. Regular humanoid shadow beings are reported to move in ways that are too quick and fluid to be natural. Some shadow people appear as clouds of black smoke that move about, taking on the form of a person before dissolving again. According to some accounts, these black shadow masses are attracted to people or places that are giving off negative emotions. Some people have encountered a part of a shadow being. They see just part of a head or maybe the whole head peering around a corner or in from a window. Some people tell about encountering shadow people in the forest. These black figures watch silently from the shadows without making any sound. Some say these shadow people are actually guardians of the forest that they're hiding in, while others think that these are ghosts of people that got lost in the forest and died out there. A friend of mine, David from the LPRS, told me about his shadow being encounter. He said that his family had moved from Camp Street to Gonzales Street here in Laredo. He was about 10 or 11 at the time. Late at night, an eerie feeling would wake him up. He didn't remember what time it was that this happened, but he does remember the events quite well. There would be a tall black shadow standing in his bedroom door. It would stand there staring at him. The shape was darker than the dark, but David wasn't scared of it. He said it wasn't intimidating or frightening at all. This would happen 3 or 4 times a week. He said it was weird because he felt as if the shadow being was watching over him for some reason, protecting him from something. David's bedroom wasn't very big, and so the shadow was about 7 or 8 feet from him. He never told anybody about this, and it's been years since those days, and he still looks back and wonders what would have happened if it had spoken to him or if he'd tried to speak to it. Could it have spoken? Michael had a shadow man encounter in the fall of 1998. He had bought a house and a friend was over helping paint the rooms before he moved in. Once all the walls were covered, his friend left for the night. Michael, being quite tired, decided he would just sleep in the living room where the paint was mostly already dry. In the middle of the night, he woke up feeling very thirsty, and so he walked into the kitchen. In the corner where the light switch was, right next to the door leading down into the basement, was the shadow of a man. Michael, being only half awake, thought that his friend had returned unannounced. He said hello to the shadow, but it didn't respond. The thought that this wasn't his friend, but an intruder, came to mind, and Michael went into the defensive mode. He pulled a pocket knife out and brandished it. The shadow moved towards him, and Michael stabbed at it with the knife. The knife went right through this thing. He was convinced that he had just stabbed a man in the kitchen of his brand new home. The shadow didn't stop, but it just kept going up until it occupied the same spot as he did. Then it passed through him, giving Michael quite a scare. He spun around to see the shadow man walking away as if nothing had just happened. It went into the dining room, passed through the wall to the outside. He was now wide awake. He searched the house, but found no indication that anyone had been there besides him. Not wanting to see this shadow man again, Michael went back to his apartment for the night. The shadow never came back. I used to work with a guy who was renting a trailer home. He said that he would be sitting at his desk and a shadow would walk by the door to his office. He lived alone, didn't even have a cat or a dog. This would happen often enough that he began to think that maybe this was a ghost. After catching sight of it many times, he said it was just a black shadow of a man, and it never did anything except walk by the doorway. After a few years in this trailer, he got transferred to another station. The owner had never said anything about other people seeing this shadow. A woman growing up in Michigan told about her encounter with a shadow man. Out of the corner of her eye, she would see a person standing at the top of the staircase. When she would turn to see who it was, there would be no one there. This happened often enough to make her think that something might be in the house besides humans. She figured that just maybe this was a ghost. She felt as if someone was watching her any time she went upstairs. One evening she was in her bedroom listening to music on her CD player. Her back was to the door, which was closed. On the wall in front of her she saw a person's shadow. Someone had come into her room without knocking. She spun around, but no one was there. Turning back to the wall, the shadow faded away. It had looked like a very tall man was in her room. One of the bedrooms had been turned into a computer room. This was back when not everyone had their own laptop. You had one desktop for the whole family. Probably used dial up as well. For those of you that never got to enjoy this experience, a dial up was a bit slow. If someone sent you a picture, you would hit the download and then you'd sit there and read a book waiting for it to appear. The thing is, a lot of times when you hit the download button, you couldn't stop the download. All you could do is sit there and wait for whatever the photo was to show up. Back to the girl with the computer. She was sitting at the desk once more, back to the door. She was alone in the house with only the family dog there to keep her company, but he was downstairs asleep, not being much company. As she was visiting some websites, she heard a creaking sound on the stairs. Someone was walking up. She thought that maybe it was her grandparents who had come by for a visit, and her grandmother just loved to sneak up and scare her. So she sat there waiting for the right moment. Seeing a shadow out of the corner of her eye, she spun around and said hi real fast, hoping to startle her grandmother. Now, there was no one there. Any time the family would move to a new house, she would still see shadows moving around without anyone there to make them. Whenever she did see a shadow or heard sounds of something in the house when she was all alone, she would say, "I know you're here. If you want to talk or something, go ahead." So far, nothing ever spoke back to her. Her dog also seemed to be aware of these shadow beings moving around. She would watch as he would follow the shape moving around the room. She says she has never felt threatened by these shadow beings. She read up on them and wonders what they are and what they were doing. How often Have dogs and cats sat looking at something that only they can see? Could there be a shadow being moving around that we're not aware of because of some reason or other? Why is it you see them sometimes and other times you don't? Not all shadow beings look like men. Some have been described as being monsters, shadow monsters. This one witness said that he had seen them in the mountains, but I didn't see any mention of which mountains, just somewhere here in the U.S. The creatures were huge, but their arms and legs were extremely skinny, to the point of looking like skeletons. The shadows don't seem to try avoiding human contact. The witness said he's seen them for years standing near the road. They just stay in one place, only vanishing from sight after being there for way too long. In 2013, Jen was visited by a late night shadow man. It stood in the door to her room watching. This repeated over the next several months, just standing in the doorway looking at her. After getting kind of used to this, one night Jen didn't see him. She hoped that this was the end of scary things at night. The next morning at breakfast, her grandmother asked who she was with late last night. Jen said that she'd stayed in her room all night. The grandmother said that she had seen Jen out in the yard dancing with a tall, dark man who was wearing a wide brimmed hat and a long coat. She said that she couldn't see its face, but Jen seemed to be having a good time. Jen never saw him again, and her grandmother never mentioned any more late night dancing. When Johnny was 7 years old, about 2009, he said he would see a shadow man walking across his room from one corner to the next. The shape was of a man, but very tall. He said the head was close to the ceiling. At first, Johnny was able to convince himself he was just dreaming, but after too many sightings, he determined that this was an actual thing. The first few times the shadow man was in his room, Johnny ran to the bathroom and locked himself in, waiting for whatever this thing was to leave. After a few encounters, he would just stay in his bed, but he would keep a close eye on the shape. Soon he was able to almost ignore these late night visits. Not completely, but he no longer felt threatened by them. At their home here in Laredo, Josue and his family occasionally see shadow beings. No one is ever harmed by these wispy creatures, but they do move things around. One night they had several pictures taken down from the wall. These were religious scenes, Jesus, Mary, the Last Supper. All of these pictures were taken off of the wall and placed facing the wall. Thinking that somebody was messing with them, maybe playing tricks, they changed all the locks on their doors. A few weeks later, Erica, that's Josue's wife, walked into the bathroom where she found that all the shampoo and conditioner bottles were sitting on the floor in a circle. The toothbrushes were in the middle, forming a cross. This activities have slowed down in their home, but they've never completely stopped. Rose said she got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. The hallway was dark, so she was in a well lit room, and what was outside didn't seem like a big thing. When she finished up, she was flipping the light switch off while at the same time pulling the door open. In the hallway, just as the light went out, she saw a huge black shadow with a broad brimmed hat at the far end of the hall. Her only thought was run for the bedroom. So she did. Once safe in her bed, she immediately fell asleep, just like the other stories that I mentioned. Years later, she is still scared by what she had seen just as the lights went off. Nancy lived in a mobile home in the Moreno Additions subdivision of Laredo. After having had some paranormal activity in his home in Nuevo Laredo, her father had decided to buy a new home, hoping that there wouldn't be any unexplainable baggage. Well, the best laid plans, as they say. Nancy's first encounter took place when she was about 9 or 10 years old. She was sharing a room with her older sister. They had a room on the west end of the trailer home, with the hallway going right past it towards her brother's room. Her sister had told Nancy that in the middle of the night there was a shadow that crept along the hallway between the kitchen and the bathroom. Nancy just thought that her older sister was seeing things or maybe messing with her. Shadows don't move around on their own. One night, Nancy saw the shadow. They always slept with the door open, and one night, after everyone was asleep, the two girls were up talking when a black shadow moved across the doorway. This thing didn't look like a shadow cast by anyone or anything. It looked like a person dressed in all black moving down the hall. It was visible from the head to about the waist. This thing moved like it was floating. There was no sound as of anybody walking, and if you've ever been in a trailer, you'll know that hollow sound of footsteps. The shadow being passed by with enough force that it caused the doorway to swing back and forth. Nancy was frozen with fear. She just laid there on her bed staring out the door. Her sister asked if she had seen the thing as well. Nancy was barely able to say, "Yes, turn on the lights, quick." They were both quite upset, and neither one of them wanted to get too close to that door. Finally, they mustered up enough courage to sneak out and run to their mother's room. Telling her they'd seen a shadow moving towards the bathroom, they managed to convince her to at least go have a look. Their mother didn't see anything out of the ordinary. This shadow being was seen several times a week after this. It would pass by the open door, heading towards the bathroom. Maybe it needed to go. The two sisters stopped telling their mother about it. That's the easy solution. Stop talking about it. People will stop thinking you're crazy. Eventually, they grew used to being there to the point that they mostly just ignored it. After several years, the shadow just stopped showing up. Back in 1965, Roddy Fry was 6 years old, living in Brooklyn, New York. His bedroom was right across from the bathroom, but sometimes it was all he could do to walk there when he needed it. It wasn't because of the location, it was the feeling of something there in the dark. To avoid any accidents, Roddy would lay there in the dark and wait until he heard his dad was up, who would also be needing the bathroom. The trick was to get to the hallway right as his dad was opening the bathroom door. Having someone right there in the hall helped a lot. For unknown reasons, the trip back to bed didn't ever bother him. In place of a door, his room had an old bed sheet hung up across the opening. One night, the need to go woke him. It was dark, and Roddy waited, hoping that his dad would get up soon. After a bit too long, he heard his dad walking down the hall. The door to the bathroom clicked shut, followed by the sounds of somebody in there. Roddy sat up in bed, getting ready to make his move for the hallway. There in front of him, as if passing right through the sheet, was a head and one shoulder leaning into the room. The figure was darker than the night, backlit by the bathroom light that was coming from under the door. It had a flat topped hat. In its hand was a stick like a cane. None of the features were visible, but Roddy could feel the eyes on him. He froze. This couldn't be his dad because the sounds were still coming from the bathroom. After staring at him for several minutes, the head was pulled away from the opening. Roddy heard the toilet flush, followed by the sink being turned on and then off. The need to go to the bathroom was overpowered by the fear of what was in the hallway. The only recourse was to dive back under the covers and wait till morning. As the sun was shining, the memory of the shadow being became less scary. It was easy for Roddy to convince himself that he'd simply been mistaken. The shadow being must have been his dad or someone else. He drove the imagination from his mind, burying it away so it wouldn't frighten him any more. From time to time, Roddy would see something that looked like the shadow of a cat darting by, only to vanish when he turned to look at it. Any time the memory of the shadow being would raise its ugly head, Roddy would quickly think of something else. This worked up until one night, years later. Sometime around 2000, Roddy was driving home from work. He turned on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. The subject of discussion that night was shadow beings. As he listened to Art discussing these weird creatures with the guests, the memories from that night came storming back, making Roddy practically relive that night from 1965. He was so shook up by the memory, he had to pull off the road and sit there waiting for his pulse to come down. Listening to Art Bell talking about others who had seen the same basic image was all Roddy needed to realize that shadow beings are real, and he had seen one. He still tries to not think about the shadow being, knowing they can just show up in the middle of the night and there was nothing that you can do to stop them is not the kind of thing that he wanted to dwell on. Art Bell had his own encounter with the shadow being. September 2015. Art had his studio in the house, but he did all of his ham radio work in a shack out back that he referred to as the Ham Shack. He was sitting in the room working on some of his equipment and he caught movement out of the corner of his eye to his right. Turning, he saw a shadow of a man, solid black, but there was no one there to make this shadow. It was what he described as being a human shape. The arms must have been at its sides because he didn't see them. The thing had two legs that Art could see. As Art jumped from his chair, the shadow vanished. One second it was there, and the next it was gone. He looked around the room, and the shadow was now standing right behind his chair. Before he could react, the shadow vanished again. This time it reappeared to his left. Art watched the shadow vanish a third time. He ran to his house and he grabbed a gun and he went searching for the intruder. He looked in every room, doing his best to not wake his wife or daughter. Once he'd cleared the family, he did the same thing to the yard, the big yard. He got his billion candle power flashlight and lit up everything. No one there. No footprints, no intruders, of the human kind anyway. Art does a much better job of telling this story than I can. According to everyone that has seen him, the Hat Man appears as a completely dark figure, like other shadow people. The major difference is that the hat, which isn't always the same style. Some people say it looks like a top hat, like what Abraham Lincoln wore. Others have seen a wide-brimmed fedora. Why would a shadow being wear a hat? Is this just one of those things like Bigfoot is seen in colors ranging from white to black, everything in between? I've had folks ask why ghosts are seen wearing white. Back in the old days, when a person was buried, they were placed in a white linen shroud. Linen comes out in either ivory or taupe, a very light brown, a color if you don't dye it. Ghosts have been seen in every kind of clothing imaginable. A lot of folks just don't pay attention to the sightings unless they're trying to make fun of them. Not knowing why ghosts or spirits do the things they do, we can't understand otherworldly activity. Why some shadow beings have hats on is a question we'll just have to hold on to until one of these creatures sits down for an interview. Why do some of them have a walking stick? It's one of those things. The Hat Man tends to be tall, dressed in a long coat or a cloak. Some have red eyes, while others have no features at all. The shadow is more like a solid entity. Shadow beings can be solid or they can be smoke like. People don't mention seeing any kind of clothing on shadow beings, but the Hat Man is almost always wearing a long coat or a hooded robe. A common theory of what attracts the Hat Man to a person is what they are thinking at the time. Negative thoughts or attitudes can draw the shadow beings or the Hat Man to a person. A lot of encounters were simply visual with no interaction. People see the Hat Man standing in the room, not moving around, and then he's gone. This makes me think that they're feeding off of the negativity or the fear being given off by the witness. There were a few witnesses who said that they were using a Ouija board just hours before the encounter. Some have theorized that the Hat Man is a harbinger of bad things to come, kind of like how Mothman is seen before some huge tragedy. If you are seeing a shadow being or the Hat Man in your home and you really don't want it there, here's a few suggestions that might help. The first thing is try to examine your thoughts. Are you thinking negative ideas? Depending on your beliefs, you can pray to God or your higher power. Maybe ask an angel to come stand over you during the night. If you're an atheist, well, maybe it's time to change. If you're agnostic, it's time to change as well. If prayer doesn't work, try reasoning with the shadow. Tell it to go away or order it out of your house. This takes some conviction on your part, and young kids are just out of luck there. If your son or your daughter tells you that they've seen a shadow standing in the room, instead of making fun of them, be the hero. Go into the room and order the monsters to go away. Your kids will look differently at you. If this doesn't work, it might be time to get the professionals involved. Ask your religious or spiritual leaders to come by and chase these things away. You might have to fudge the story a bit. Make yourself sound less crazy, unless you have a priest or a shaman who understands our world better than most. You might be surprised at how some religious folks don't actually believe the things that they talk about. You might also find somebody who's not just the real deal, but helpful as well. Some paranormal groups have contacts in the religious departments that are willing to help out when asked. The naysayers will preach to us about sleep paralysis and pareidolia. Mention you saw anything like a shadow being, and they will say, "You're just imagining things." I believe they do this out of fear. Explain away the monsters so they don't exist. Good strategy. It worked very well September 1st, 1939. Not all monsters are real, but not all encounters are our imagination either. If you're seeing a shadow being or the Hat Man, try to look closely at it if you can. Examine it and examine yourself at the same time. Ask yourself, why are you seeing this thing? Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, spread it around. Like Tony Merkel says, share the show. Don't care how you share it, just share it. If you have any suggestions for a show you'd like to hear, you can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is go to Amazon.com and buy one of my books, Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, and Paranormal Stories. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.